Hey, Lea leaned in and said something to Freddie.
Don't let them change you. Keep working on what makes you different and what makes you special. It was great advice, but it caused me some problems.
But what could change Freddie Adu?
Soccer is going to explode, and it's going to be around this kid.
We were the Beatles. Everywhere we went, it was the Freddie Show.
And with that came the expectation, and with that came the pressure.
New episodes of American Prodigy drop Tuesdays from Blue Wire Podcasts.
Welcome, Notre Dame fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I am Vince D'Addario, the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com. And with me, as always, is Sir Brian Driscoll. He's the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And I decided to give you Sir. You are now officially, I have knighted you. You are Sir. You're welcome.
I'm Irish, by the way, not British. But it's okay.
Okay.
I'm not mad at you.
You're over there somewhere. But anyway, we have an interesting discussion to have today, Brian. We want to talk about, look, it's been out there that Clark Lea had interviewed for the head coaching job at Vanderbilt, even though the athletic director said they want an offensive-minded coach. Clark Lea's phone still rang. Mm-hmm. I know we're both shocked by that fact.
Mm-hmm. You say sarcastically.
Of course I do. But yes, he took that interview. And so we're going to talk about, what are the pros and cons of taking the Vanderbilt job? I would say right off the bat, people would fall on the con side, especially if you're a Notre Dame fan, because
and that's the reason,
Clark Lea around, right?
And that's the reason we're having this conversation is because I think the reaction to it was like, why in the world would he consider doing this?
Right.
And there are reasons for it, and
Sure.
we'll get into those after we kind of do a bit of here's what the latest is going on with the situation.
Speaking of what is the latest, I hear that you're hearing some things about this particular situation. So why don't you take us on that roller coaster of the job carousel?
Yeah, well, one thing that I'm hearing a lot is that there's going to be some turnover on the Notre Dame coaching staff after the season, which is kind of expected. When you have the kind of season Notre Dame has, there's going to be coaches that are going to be hot commodities. And, of course, Clark Lea is going to be part of that. And I think there's just some other areas where I think the staff would like to maybe go in a different direction in a spot. And then there's other coaches that are looking for head coaching opportunities, which is, again, understandable when you've had the kind of season Notre Dame has had. So we'll get into specific names kind of down the road when the season's over with. But that's kind of what I'm hearing is potentially going to happen. And, of course, Clark Lea is the most obvious. And so my sources have been really since the summer, I was told that Clark Lea wants to be head coach. And I don't think anybody is shocked by that information. Talked to a couple people this week, and there's a feeling around the program that after the playoff is done, he's going to be gone. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to take the Vanderbilt job, because Vanderbilt's not going to be the only school that's interested in Clark Lea for the head coach. But that after that initial comment by the athletic director, which was they wanted an offensive-minded coach, that has since, in my opinion, from what I'm being told, has changed, and that there is a legitimate push by some influencers around that program. I think we know who the influencers are, to take Clark Lea very seriously and his candidacy very seriously. And for the obvious reason that is, you hire someone that's got SEC experience, right? That's not Clark Lea. If that's what you're looking for, it's not Clark Lea, other than when he played. But the reality is the people that are making decisions at Vanderbilt, from what I understand, do get the fact that, hey, we're not like the other SEC schools.
No, they're
so
not. Because
you had success at Kentucky or South Carolina or Florida or Georgia or Alabama or LSU doesn't mean you have any clue what it's like to build a winner at Vanderbilt. Well, what coach on the radar does have experience with that? It's Clark Lea.
Sure.
So because he's at Notre Dame and he's been at Syracuse and Wake Forest. Wake Forest is a very good academic school as well. You look at UCLA. He was at UCLA as a graduate assistant. He's been at places that have reputations of being good academic schools. Not all of them. Bowling Green is not a good academic school. But you get the point of where I'm going with this, which is he's a little different than some of the other candidates that people are pushing for.
Sure.
And of course, he's – the success he's had at Notre Dame is sort of impeccable. And I think there's also a notion that you want to get a guy that's not going to go the James Franklin route, which is come here for 3 years, build a win, and bounce.
Yeah, right.
Clark Lea is attractive from that standpoint because there is a thought, and we'll get into the reasons why, that he wouldn't necessarily be if you come here and win for 3 years, you're going to take the next best job. So there is, now that's not a given, but there's that thought. So the latest I'm hearing is that there's a lot more momentum on the Vanderbilt side to take Clark Lea's candidacy seriously. That doesn't mean that Clark Lea would ultimately take the job.
Because Clark Lea's camp take this job seriously.
Yes, they are taking it very seriously. Doesn't mean that they're gonna take, because like anytime you're in a situation like Clark Lea's, and now we're moving away from sort of what I'm hearing, and this is how coaching works. This is more big picture. Is you don't just take a job to take a job when you have all the kind of leverage that Clark Lea has, which is I'm at Notre Dame. I can stay at Notre Dame. I'm happy at Notre Dame. We got a really good thing going here. Do you see the talent I'm going to have coming back next year? You know what I mean? My family's happy here. We're in a state with a low cost, it doesn't cost a lot to live in the state of Indiana. Even in St. Joseph County, it's not a super expensive state. And so there's a lot of, he has leverage. And look, I lost how many NFL players from my last year's defense, and we're even better this year, So I think he has a lot of leverage to say, if I'm going to take over, you got to prove to me that you're serious about competing. And here's the things that you need to do to show me you're serious about competing. Sure. So if they're not willing to do that, then I could see a situation where he says, thanks, but no thanks. So I don't think it's a lock that even if he's offered the job, he would take it. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be offered the job. That's not what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing he has been offered a job or is going to be offered a job. But I'm hearing that there are people that have some say in this that think he is the guy that should ultimately, be the candidate. Now, there's other quality candidates for the job. Lance Leopold, who's the head coach at Buffalo. I've heard Jamie Chadwell from Coastal Carolina. So there's coaches that are looking at this job, but I'm hearing there's momentum gaining for Clark Lea to be the candidate they should focus on, which obviously didn't seem like it would be the case when the athletic director made her comments regarding they want an offensive-minded coach, which was such – Vince, we talked about this on the radio with Sean and Darren. I mean, it was such a narrow-minded, misguided view that is just like – for me, it was like, this is just another reason why you don't want to work at Vanderbilt.
Right. I mean, why would you wipe out half of the candidates with one sentence? Like, that just makes no sense.
And let's use some common sense here, right? The two best teams in the SEC in the last few years, the teams that have won national championships, are both led by defensive-minded coaches. Yes. Ed Orgeron at LSU, Nick Saban at Alabama, Georgia's head coach, the former defensive coordinator. I mean, Kentucky, look at the turnaround they've had under Mark Stoops. What was he? Defensive coordinator. So it just was such a narrow-minded and just kind of a silly
it's just uninformed
comment.
I think it felt uninformed to me.
Yeah. Or maybe off the cuff. I mean, maybe that was it too. And how Twitter is. People a lot of times don't think before, whatever.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that's kind of been walked back a little bit internally. They're more open to the right. Now, I think they would. Now, what that's going to mean is they're going to want to hear from whoever the candidates are. What's your plan for having an offense that can score points?
Right.
That should be a conversation for even if an offensive-minded coach. What's your method for scoring points here?
Sure.
Because again, you can't do, if you come from, Georgia, you can't say, we're going to recruit a bunch of 5-star receivers and running backs and offensive linemen.
No, you're not.
No,
you're not.
So anyway, that's the deal there. But let's kind of segue into kind of the pros and cons of why I think Clark Lea might give this job a much closer look than a lot of Notre Dame fans think he should or think that he will. But before we do that, Vince, a little message from our sponsor. Indeed, 2020 has already shaped how we work, and it's almost over. Businesses across the globe are challenged to be their most efficient, which means every hire is critical, and Indeed is here to help.
Indeed is the #1 job site in the world with more total visits than any other job site, according to ComScore. Indeed helps you find quality candidates quickly so that you can focus on hiring the person you need to keep your business going.
And unlike other sites, Indeed gives you full control and payment flexibility over your hiring. You only pay for what you need, and you can pause your account anytime, and there are no long-term contracts.
And now, Indeed's new way of matching you with candidates instantly delivers a short list of quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed match your job criteria that you can contact the moment you sponsor a job, making Indeed the only job site that can move as fast as you do.
73% of online job seekers in the United States are visiting Indeed each month, according to ComScore. Total visits. So it's clear Indeed can help get you the quality hire you need. That's why more than 3 million businesses worldwide use Indeed for hiring.
So right now, Indeed is offering our listeners a free $75 credit to boost your job post, which means more quality candidates will see it fast. Try Indeed out with a $75 credit at Indeed.com/Blue Wire. This is their best offer available anywhere. So go right now to Indeed.com/Blue Wire. Offer valid through December 31st. Terms and conditions apply.
So Vince, let's get back into this Clark Lea conversation.
Yes, sir. So Brian, from where I sit, I hear the fans talking and my friends for that matter, why would Clark Lea even be considering this job? There's cons all over the place to taking the head job at Vanderbilt, and that being your first head coaching job, because being in the head coaching profession, it's important what your first head coaching job is, because you don't want to take that job where you're not going to be at least successful on the terms of what that job is, and then have to fall back to the assistant coaching ranks, et cetera, and you basically have to regain that momentum as a head coach.
And a lot of coaches never do. I mean,
absolutely.
We could have a long podcast about coaches that took the bad job, took the wrong job, that are now either coaching at like the FCS level or the low Power 5 level, or not Power 5 level, the FBS level, or they're just assistants because they took the wrong job, and then we've seen successful coaches. Tom O'Brien at Boston College comes to mind every time I have this conversation. Randy Edsall, when he left UConn, and they took those jobs, we're like, that doesn't fit your personality, doesn't fit your background. Tom O'Brien was a very good football coach at Boston College, took the NC State job. He was a disaster. Randy Edsall was a darn good football coach at UConn, took the Maryland job, and he's never been the same. He can't even win at UConn anymore, and it's just like, yeah, you took the money, and I understand why you took those jobs, but those were bad fits for you, and they're pro. So fit is part of it. Taking jobs at places where you're just going to have a harder time winning. And to your point, look, Purdue is not expected to win on the same level as Notre Dame. So how that coach is going to be evaluated is going to be different. Vanderbilt's coach is not going to be expected to compete for SEC championships. If it happens, phenomenal. You're going to get a huge pay raise, but that's not the expectation. The expectation is get to a bowl game. That's the goal.
Right.
Get to a bowl. If you can get to a bowl game every year, you're gonna be a guy that's. That's the reason Derek Mason got 8 years at Vanderbilt, because he went to a couple bowl games.
Right. Absolutely.
And it just took this year's absolute dumpster fire for him to get fired. So go ahead, Vince.
Sorry, I was just to say, as a head coach, I can see how the bar being set a little bit lower can be appealing, because you're like, look, I've had all this success at my assistant coaching job. Now this is all I have to do to be considered a success in my first head coaching job. Now, of course, there are many more variables that go along with that.
Right, and that's kind of the cons of Vanderbilt. And number one is, we talked about, there's leadership. I think there's bad leadership at Vanderbilt. I just don't think it's a place where you look at and say, hey, that's got some really good people in charge that they're going to support you and give you the resources you need and those kind of things. Because, for example, Brian Kelly has had there's a lot of people that don't like Jack Swarbrick, and I understand some of the reasons why. I'm just looking specifically at the football program. Having Jack Swarbrick as the athletic director during the Brian Kelly tenure has been phenomenal for Brian Kelly, because Brian Kelly's been working on building a football team specifically. Jack Swarbrick's done a lot of the Under Armour deal, the new field. He's had an athletic director that's going to bat for his program to say, let's make this better, the new locker room. That's not necessarily Brian Kelly doing all the work. That's Jack Swarbrick, and then Brian Kelly. Right. And then Brian Kelly's fighting that fight too, but it's not happening if your athletic director is not leading the charge.
Agreed.
So that's why leadership is very important. Now, maybe there's people in other sports that aren't as high on Jack Swarbrick, but Brian Kelly probably has to love Jack Swarbrick because of what he's done for the football program. So I think leadership is an issue there. I think that it's in a tough league. Everybody says, well, James Franklin won 9 games. One of the years James Franklin won 9 games, Tennessee had a losing record, Florida was 4-8, and Georgia went 8-5 and unranked. It was and Kentucky stunk. It was a bad league. South Carolina was like the only team worth a darn in the SEC East back then. And they won a lot of they played Wake Forest in those 2 years non-conference. Wake Forest had a losing record both years. They didn't beat a single team that finished in the top 25. They beat number 15 Georgia one year, but Georgia fell out of the top 25 because they weren't very good. So he was there at the right time. Timing matters. Right now, you look at the SEC East and you think Florida is rolling with Dan Mullen. Georgia's recruiting as well as anybody in the country right now with Kirby Smart. Now, I don't think Kirby Smart's a very good head coach from a game day standpoint, but he's recruiting tons of talent, which means they're going to win games.
I was going to say, yeah, exactly.
Missouri has a first-year head coach who's doing a great job, Eli Drinkwitz. Kentucky, Mark Stoops is doing a great job there. South Carolina just hired a new head coach. We'll see how they do. And then you look at I'm missing one SEC. Tennessee is a dumpster fire, but Tennessee's always a good hire or a good year away from getting back on track. So the SEC East is very challenging right now. It's a much tougher division than it was when James Franklin was winning 9 games a year. So pointing to the James Franklin thing doesn't really help. It's a tough league, and that's a con for me. And then there's no tradition of winning. There's nothing you can sell to recruits to say, hey, look, we're going to get back to this glory days of this time.
Right.
I mean, there's just nothing to lean on. And there's a reason for that. And it's not just, hey, they have tough academics and all that. There's a tradition of not really pushing to have great sports and great football. I mean, where Vanderbilt has been successful in sports are the sports that don't cost a lot of money, baseball, at times basketball. I don't know if there's the necessarily the push to be great at football. And when we talk about the pros, we'll get into a couple things that they're saying. But for me, it's a bad football program, and it has been for a long time. Outside of a 2-year window with James Franklin when the SEC East was garbage, which you can't replicate that now. It's been a I've heard the term coach's graveyard. Because outside of Gary DiNardo and James Franklin, guys that are head coaches there don't move on to become head coaches somewhere else.
Right.
It just hasn't been that way.
Right.
So, then part of it's
a pretty good list of cons there.
Yeah. It is. But,
there is a bright side. There is another side of the rainbow, they say. And we want to get to that. But first, we want you to hear from another one of our sponsors. Football is back in full swing. You might not be at a game this year, but you can still be in on the action at BetOnline. BetOnline is going the extra mile to make sure you get in on every possible chance to win this season. From game spreads and totals to team, player, and coaching props, BetOnline gives you more options to wager than anywhere else. You can get in on their season-opening bonuses today and start off wagering on wins, division, and championship futures all day, every day. Head to BetOnline today and take advantage of all the great sign-up bonuses. Don't forget to use the promo code BLUEWIRE at betonline.ag. That's Blue Wire, all one word. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, so as I said, there is another side to the rainbow here. We just got done listing all the cons of taking the Vanderbilt job, and there's a lot, frankly, but there are some bright spots. There's a reason that Clark Lea is taking this job seriously.
And for me, there's two with Clark Lea specifically. There's 2 parts of this. One is a sports aspect of it, and then the other is a family aspect. So let's start with the sports one first, Vince. Number one to me is all the cons we just talked about. For some coaches,
Those
can
are
be
positives.
attractive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's like, well, number one, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the bar is so low that we don't have to win 10 games a year for me to be happy and getting pay raises, right?
Right.
So that's going to give us time. We're going to have time. They're coming off they're going to not win a game this year, right? So they're not going to expect us to win 10 next year, right? So there's time for us to do this the right way. For a guy like Clark Lea, who's very much a intellectual teacher, do it the right way, build a culture, there's I think an attractiveness to the fact that we're not expected to win in 3 years. We're not expected to go win the SEC East in 3 years. So we have some time to build the culture the way that we want to build it. I think that's an attractive thing for some coaches. If you're a coach who's just about, I'm going to go win and I'm going to use this job to springboard me to the next job, then it's not attractive. But I don't think that's what Clark Lea's looking for. And I think Notre Dame fans have convinced themselves that Clark Lea's looking for a job that he can go win for 2 or 3 years and then come back to Notre Dame when Brian
As the
Kelly
head
leaves.
coach. Yeah, right.
Maybe he does, but I don't think that's necessarily the move.
Right.
If it happens, it happens. But his next move is, here's my career goals. Here's what's important to me and my family. And if that path leads me back to Notre Dame someday, great. But that's not necessarily why you make that move. Right. And so I think there's an attractiveness to Vanderbilt for that reason. And Notre Dame fans, I think, are freaking out a little bit because, like, if he goes to Vanderbilt, he's not going to win in 3 years, and then he's not going to be able to come back as head coach. Not necessarily. I mean, again,
Right.
you know, it's like I've pointed to Jeff Brom as a guy that I think would be great to replace Brian Kelly. Say, well, he went like 13-13 his first 2 years. Yeah, at Purdue with a terrible roster and
a pretty tough schedule.
Right, and so that's an impressive thing for me. Ara Parseghian had a 500, a game over 500 in a decade at Northwestern. Right, well. Yeah, if you talk to Lou Samoji, he's like, yeah, that was really impressive at Northwestern back then. So anyway, so I think it's just a different mindset. I think it fits Clark Lea's personality well. They say, well, you can't recruit top players. Well, Clark Lea doesn't really recruit a lot of top players now. If you really look at him,
that's a good point.
He looks for guys that he can develop
and that fit in his system.
Yes, and he looks for guys. He's not worried about bringing in guys that can play right away. I mean, that's just that. Now, that doesn't mean if there's a Kyle Hamilton or an Isaiah Foskey that can play in the first year or two, he's going to recruit those guys. But Clark Lea has made a living taking guys that were not highly ranked players. Jeremiah Wusu, 3-star player.
Yeah, exactly.
Adio Gandiji, 3-star player. Now, they signed him before Clark Lea took over. Think about this. Notre Dame has one of the 5 best defensive lines in the country. I don't know anybody that debates that. 3 of their 4 starters are 3-star players. The only guy that had any kind of high recruiting profile is Dalen Hayes. And
he hardly played in high school.
Right. And Jacob Lacey, Jason Adamiola are his backups, but like the starting lineup, the veterans, Justin Adamiola, 3-star player. It's been really good for Notre Dame. Isaiah Foskey wasn't a top 200 recruit coming out of high school. Ovia Gofu was a 3-star player. Drew White, starting middle linebacker, 3-star player. Him and Jeremiah Wusu were both 3-stars. They're way better than Shane Simon, the top 100 recruit, who was a buck. Right. So you look at that and you say, he's done a great job. He can get Clarence Lewis type players at Vanderbilt. He's going to be able to find Adio Gandijis at Vanderbilt and Jeremiah Wusu's at Vanderbilt. These 3-star guys that you hope that Notre Dame doesn't find late, and you build around them. And I think that fits his personality. I think that fits his coaching style. So I don't think it's going to be the turnoff. And here's the other part: Clark Lea is a very smart guy, and I don't just mean smart from the standpoint of football smart. He's an intellectual, in my opinion. And Vince, I've had the fortune to sit down and interview him a couple times for a magazine, and I spent like 2 hours with him one time because I like to talk, and I thought it's going to be, because I'd never really chatted with him before. So it's going to be difficult because he's a real quiet, reserved guy. He's not going to talk a lot. We were there for like 2.5 hours talking. We only had about 30 minutes worth of interview because he's a really deep thinker. He's an intellectual, and I think he likes players that are intellectual. And that's why I think he's been successful at Notre Dame, because there's a lot of smart kids at Notre Dame. And I think that's attractive to him, that the whole, it's tough academic standards. I don't think that's something that he's afraid of.
That's actually a check mark.
For him.
For him.
Now, for other people that would not
so much.
But for him, it is. Right. And we haven't even got into the fact that he went there. So he's obviously smart because he went to Vanderbilt. But he's an intellectual. And I think the fact that he has to recruit kids from all over the country, it's like, well, you can't just recruit Tennessee and the Carolinas and all that, because that's fine. He recruits the entire nation now, So I think that the other part is where he's had to recruit in his career before Notre Dame has helped him with what should be the base: the Carolinas, Georgia, Tennessee. He's recruited those areas when he was at Wake Forest. He played at Tennessee or Vanderbilt, obviously, but now at Notre Dame he's been able to do the national recruiting thing and be successful
name
doing
for himself.
So.
Yeah.
Right. And so that obviously helps there. And Vanderbilt has said, this is things that I've read, they're saying we're going to build a new facility and all this kind of thing. So if I'm Clark Lea, I would want that in writing.
Absolutely.
I would want that as part of my contract. If you don't do this by X number of period of time, then you have to pay me X amount of dollars, essentially, or whatever the case may be. So I think those are all pros that fit in from a football standpoint. I think that also Vanderbilt has had some pretty good defensive players in recent seasons. You know, I think the first one that pops in my head is Zach Cunningham, who was a really good linebacker. I think it was a second or third round pick recently. So I think he sees that they can recruit good football players there. Tennessee is a really good state. And one of the things about Tennessee is there's pockets of Tennessee that are similar, remind me a little bit of Atlanta, in that the better schools are private schools. You think of Montgomery Bell. Harrison Smith and Golden Tate, two great Notre Dame players from Tennessee, private school kids. Alex Bars, great Notre Dame player, private school kid. So there's some and not private schools in that, like, they're just there because they're really good athletes. You know what I mean? Like the private school I went to in high school, it was because I was smart. It's because I was an athlete and they recruited athletes. These are actually schools where you have to be a really good student.
Sure.
And so there's that. And they're not always 4-star kids that are going to Georgia or whatever the case may be. So it's a state you can get some in-state players from, right? And then you can recruit nationally because of that academic reputation. You can go out west. You can go to the southeast. You can find those 3-star sleepers that are high academic kids that aren't good enough to go to Notre Dame. You telling me Vanderbilt can't beat Northwestern for kids? Right? You're telling me Vanderbilt can't beat Duke for kids?
Well, and the fact that they're in the SEC helps with that recruiting pitch.
That's what I'm saying. So it's like if Vanderbilt, Northwestern, or Duke are all going for the same kid, Vanderbilt can win those battles.
Yeah, no doubt.
With the right coach.
Right, sure.
And that's the key.
And the right staff, which is something he's going to have to put together, which
that's
would be –
always going to be – but I think Clark Lea would be a guy you'd want to work for.
I would, personally.
With his personality and his
I'll send him my resume. I hear Nashville's beautiful this time of year.
I'll put in a good word for you, Vince.
Thanks, buddy.
But no, I think he's a guy that would be able to attract young coaches because he's a teacher.
Sure.
He's going to give them an opportunity to coach. They're going to talk to the guys he's worked with and say, hey, look, he set the standard, but he let me do my thing. He let me coach. There was a level of accountability. I had to do my job. I had to do my job well. I had to work hard.
Is great.
But he let me do my thing. He showed me a level of trust. If I really went to bat for a recruit, he'd say, okay, we're going to take this kid, that kind of thing. So I think that is something that would attract him to it. And here's the final piece that people have to understand about why he would look at it. Clark Lea, in my few interactions with him, he talks a lot about his family. I think him and Mike Elston are very similar in that regard, in that, one of the reasons Mike Elston has been at Notre Dame for 11 years is not necessarily because he hasn't had other options. It's because his family is at the heart of every decision he makes. And if a job is good for him but not his family, he's not going to take it.
Right.
And I think Clark Lea's that way. Clark Lea's from Nashville. Not did he just play at Vanderbilt, but his family's from Nashville. He's a father of young kids.
Yes, he is.
If you have an opportunity, you want to be a head coach. You want to be a head coach at a school that fits a certain profile, which Vanderbilt fits in a lot of ways. And my kids can grow up around, family. That's an attractive piece of it that may not matter to some coaches and probably doesn't matter to fans. They don't think a coach should think about that. But as a father and as a husband, you absolutely think about that. And so I think that is to me why I think this job is going to be attractive to him. And if he can get Vanderbilt to commit to some certain things and make some certain promises, I could see him taking this job very seriously.
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't think it's the automatic no-brainer, no way that I think a lot of fans think that it is. I think there is a level of attractiveness. Plus, I think to some coaches, there's always that desire to, I don't want to continue a tradition. I want to start one.
Sure.
And Clark Lea just strikes me, Vince, as the kind of guy that would rather build something up from nothing than to take something over and keep it going. Right. That's just been my read on him and as a person. And I because that's the challenge. I actually think that's a more challenging thing, and I kind of respect that a little bit.
Well, I hate to say it, but everything you said, it sounds like what I would want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to build a program from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing that right now.
Yeah.
That is what entices me, being on the ground floor or something, not going in and taking over a big time program, and just sitting back and just watch, I like to build, and everything you're saying about Clark Lea is very exciting to me personally. I think that would be awesome. Do you have an inkling on which way this is going to go?
No.
I mean, if you had to make a prediction.
No, because I think right now Clark Lea is locked in on getting ready for Clemson.
Good answer.
I think that's really. I mean, he did the interview, right? So it's a Sunday after your game.
Sure.
You have a bye week coming up. It was a perfect time for it, right? He did it right away, and now it's back to work. So I think for him, it's hey, let's get through this. Let's beat Clemson, and then we'll worry about that. So I don't think he's necessarily thinking too much about that. I think that also there's interviews taking place. Vanderbilt, even if he knocked it out of the park and Vanderbilt thinks he's the guy, they're going to interview other people.
Of course. Yeah, right.
So it's like kind of like, let's process play out. But my understanding is he's locked in on, now that he's back from the interview, he's locked in on, let's get ready to go win an ACC championship.
Well,
so,
that's what I like to hear.
I don't think this is something that's going to happen over the next week or two, even if he does get it. I think this is going to take a little bit longer. There's no visits that are happening right now. The early signing period is Wednesday, so it's not like it's going to impact recruiting to hurry up and make a decision. It's make the right decision.
Yeah.
If it takes you a little longer to make the right decision, it is what it is. You make the right decision because this is a long-term hire anyway. So you don't need to make rushed reactions to save a recruiting class that isn't very good anyway. In a pandemic year where you can't even get kids on campus.
Right.
You know,
you wouldn't be able to give a good recruiting pitch.
Make the right hire, whether that's Clark Lea or somebody else, make the right hire and let it play out. So no, I don't think that there's necessarily leaning either way. I think because, like I said, right now, I think Clark Lea's focus is
good.
Now the interview's behind him is let's go beat Clemson.
There it is. Will he stay or will he go? That is the question on everybody's mind. I know which way I'm falling, but we will cross that bridge another time. So make sure you stay locked into irishbreakdown.com. We've got all kinds of good stuff over there. But like Brian said, leading into the early signing day, we're going to have all kinds of podcasts, breaking down the class. And we are also going to have everything over on irishbreakdown.com. So stay locked in. Continue to listen. We appreciate it. And go Irish. We'll talk to you next time.